Tonight, what we're witnessing is not just another tragic chapter in this brutal war. It's a turning point. Because when Russia decided yet again to hit civilians, Ukraine's response was not hesitation, not outrage alone, but swift, calculated, and absolutely brilliant retaliation. When the first explosions tore through Kharkiv and Dnipro, it wasn't the sound of war echoing across distant front lines. It was the sound of deliberate terror striking at the heart of civilian life. Russia's attack this time was not aimed at military installations or defense infrastructure. It was aimed at families, schools, and apartment buildings. It was, by every measure, a choice to instill fear, to crush morale, and to remind the world that the Kremlin's playbook still believes brutality equals power. But what unfolded was not submission. It was outrage, resilience, and a renewed determination to fight back smarter, stronger, and faster than before. The images that emerged within hours told a story of heartbreak and defiance intertwined. Streets, once filled with morning markets, became scenes of smoke and shattered glass. Parents carried their children through rubble-strewn paths, dazed and disbelieving. Yet behind every broken window and burning car, there was a spark, an anger that refused to fade quietly into grief. Because Ukrainians have seen this before, they've lived through Mariupol, through Bucha, through every act of cruelty Russia has unleashed since 2022. But what Russia seems incapable of understanding is that every new act of violence doesn't weaken Ukraine, it galvanizes it. Intelligence officials confirmed that these strikes were not random. Precision-guided missiles, launched from deep within Russian territory, were targeted to inflict maximum psychological damage. They hit residential clusters far from any military presence. Analysts suggest this was meant to send a message, a brutal reminder that Russia could still reach into Ukraine's civilian heartland, even as its military struggles at the front line. But the real message received, both inside Ukraine and across the international community, was the opposite. Moscow's tactics are becoming more desperate, more erratic, and more morally bankrupt with every passing day. And yet, amid the horror, something remarkable began to happen. Within hours of the attack, Ukrainian emergency units were not only rescuing the wounded, but documenting, tracking, and sharing data with military intelligence. The coordination between civil defense and national command centers was seamless, a sign of how deeply Ukraine's society has adapted to this long, grinding war. What Russia fails to grasp is that Ukraine's strength now lies not only in its army, but in its unity. Teachers, engineers, doctors, even farmers, everyone contributes to a defense system that blends courage with calculation. As the dust settled over Dnipro, the questions began flooding in from world leaders. Why now? Why target civilians yet again? The timing, many analysts believe, was strategic in its cynicism. Russia's military setbacks in the Donbass and its growing internal dissent have forced the Kremlin to turn outward, to showcase strength through fear. When military victories fade, propaganda thrives on pain. By hitting civilians, Putin hopes to regain control of a narrative that has been slipping away for months. But that narrative no longer belongs to him. It belongs to a nation that refuses to be defined by victimhood. Even in the wake of tragedy, Ukraine's leadership responded with clarity and conviction. President Volodymyr Zelensky didn't just condemn the strikes, he promised accountability. He spoke directly to both Ukrainians and the international audience, not in the language of vengeance, but in the language of justice. We will remember every name, every family, every child, he said. And those responsible will face consequences, not someday, but soon. That was not a threat born of emotion. It was a statement grounded in confidence. Because Ukraine's intelligence network is now one of the most advanced, well-coordinated systems in modern warfare, one capable of tracing not just missile paths, but the decision-makers behind them. The power of this moment lies not only in what was destroyed, but in what survived, the spirit of defiance. Every Russian missile that lands on civilian soil further isolates Moscow on the global stage. Even nations that once stayed neutral are beginning to question the logic of standing beside a government that so openly violates every humanitarian principle. In the United Nations, the echoes of condemnation grew louder, not as diplomatic rhetoric, but as a moral awakening. Russia's campaign of terror may shatter buildings, but it cannot shatter the will of a nation that now defines strength, not through fear, but through faith in its own endurance. This wasn't just another strike, it was a revelation of character. Russia revealed its weakness through cruelty. Ukraine revealed its strength through survival. And as the world watched Kharkiv burn, what stood out was not the devastation, but the unmistakable truth that every act meant to break Ukraine only binds it closer together. In this war of shadows and fire, the loudest sound is not the blast of a missile, it's the heartbeat of a nation that refuses to stop. The moment the missiles hit Kharkiv and Dnipro, Ukraine's leadership didn't waste a second. There was no confusion, no pause, no frantic scramble for response. Within hours, what the world witnessed was a masterclass in precision warfare, a swift, methodical, and brilliantly executed counterstrike that redefined what modern retaliation looks like. This was not blind rage or chaos disguised as courage. It was intelligence fused with discipline. Ukraine didn't just strike back, it struck back with purpose. Every target was calculated, every move deliberate, and every second counted. Behind the scenes, the operation unfolded like clockwork. Intelligence officers who had been tracking Russian flight patterns for days sent encrypted alerts through the military network. Commanders at forward bases moved into immediate coordination with drone pilots, artillery teams, and cyber warfare units. The retaliation that would unfold was not about matching brutality with brutality. It was about dismantling the machinery of terror that had fueled Russia's assault. Ukraine's response was swift, but more importantly, it was strategic, the kind of measured precision that only comes from a nation that's been fighting not just to survive, but to outthink its enemy. As night fell, the sky over Russian-occupied territory lit up. Ukrainian drones, small, silent, and nearly undetectable, crossed into the airspace that Moscow once claimed as impenetrable. Within minutes, explosions ripped through fuel depots and command posts that had coordinated the earlier strikes on civilians. One by one, the logistics veins that fed Russia's war machine were severed. Analysts watching the radar feeds in NATO intelligence centers called it a textbook example of asymmetric warfare. What made it extraordinary was not the scale, but the precision. Ukraine wasn't aiming for symbolism. It was cutting arteries, not scratching skin. Each strike sent a ripple of shock through the Russian chain of command. Communications went dark in several field units, supply trucks halted mid-route, and emergency orders from Moscow scrambled to restore damaged satellite links. For a moment, the same empire that had prided itself on dominance looked disoriented, like a boxer, stunned by a hit he never saw coming. The Kremlin's silence was telling. For hours, no official statement came. Russian state media stumbled through vague reports about minor fires and logistical mishaps. But independent monitors and satellite images told a different story. The revenge was real, immediate, and devastatingly effective. The brilliance of Ukraine's response lay not just in timing, but in restraint. It could have chosen to target civilian zones inside Russia in emotional retaliation. It didn't. Instead, it chose intelligence over impulse. That single choice sent a message far beyond the battlefield. It told the world that Ukraine is not a nation driven by revenge. It is a nation guided by strategy, by law, and by an unshakable sense of purpose. That contrast between Russia's cruelty and Ukraine's control was striking, and it reshaped global perception overnight. Western analysts, often cautious in praise, described the operation as one of the most disciplined retaliatory campaigns in modern European warfare. And yet, behind this cold precision lies something deeply human, a nation's heartbeat pulsing through every tactical decision. The soldiers executing these missions are not faceless combatants. Many of them have families in the very cities that were attacked hours earlier. Their motivation was not hate, but protection. That's what gives Ukraine's military operations their moral edge. They are fueled by defense, not destruction. When these strikes hit their targets, they weren't just explosions on Russian soil. They were messages etched in fire. You will not terrorize our people and walk away untouched. In the hours that followed, Ukraine's skies grew quieter. The retaliation was complete. But the message continued to echo across international airwaves in Washington, Brussels, and London. Allies saw proof that their intelligence sharing, technology transfers, and strategic training had matured into a lethal symbiosis. Ukraine no longer needed to react with desperation. It could now respond with precision and confidence. The shift was psychological as much as tactical. The world saw that Ukraine was not only surviving, it was adapting, evolving, mastering the art of turning defense into dominance. By the next morning, the Kremlin was left scrambling to justify the unjustifiable. Russia had hit civilians. Ukraine had hit back at the machinery of war. One side had bombed playgrounds, the other had dismantled fuel depots and radar towers. In that contrast, the moral balance of this war became clearer than ever before. Ukraine's retaliation wasn't just an act of war, it was an act of warning. A warning that every act of terror would now meet a response so fast, so focused, and so brilliantly executed that even Moscow would have to think twice before trying again. What Ukraine proved in those decisive hours was something no weapon can measure: the power of preparation, intelligence, and unity. When Russia struck civilians, it expected despair. What it got instead was a masterstroke of precision, a counterstrike that turned pain into purpose and tragedy into tactical brilliance. The brilliance of Ukraine's counterattack didn't lie merely in the firepower it unleashed, but in the intelligence that made it possible. Every missile launch, every drone strike, every coordinated move across the front was the result of months, perhaps years, of strategic evolution. This was not improvisation born out of desperation. It was the calculated precision of a nation that had turned data into defense and surveillance into strength. When Russia targeted civilians, Ukraine didn't just retaliate emotionally. It responded with information, accuracy, and insight that exposed how deeply it now understands its enemy. What makes this moment so defining is the way Ukraine has transformed warfare itself. In a conflict once dominated by tanks, trenches, and brute force, intelligence has become the new weapon of choice. Satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and real-time drone surveillance combined to form a battlefield picture so clear, so dynamic, that every Ukrainian strike seemed choreographed to perfection. Sources close to NATO intelligence confirmed that within minutes of the Russian bombardment, Ukraine's command centers were already tracking the exact origin of the missiles. They knew the launch coordinates, the radar frequencies, and even the communications chatter from the Russian units responsible. And they didn't just store that data, they weaponized it. It's a new kind of warfare, algorithmic, adaptive, and astonishingly precise. Ukrainian military intelligence has been building what one analyst described as a living map, a constantly updating digital model of Russian troop movements, fuel supplies, and command links. The moment Moscow launched those civilian-targeted strikes, that map lit up like a pulse monitor under stress. Within hours, targets were identified, verified through multiple data streams, and queued for precision retaliation. That speed, moving from analysis to action in under 6 hours, is almost unheard of in conventional warfare. It signals a level of coordination and technological mastery that rivals even the most advanced Western militaries. Behind this operation lies a partnership that blends Ukrainian ingenuity with Western technology. American reconnaissance satellites, British electronic intercept systems, and European data sharing networks all fed into Kyiv's central command, creating a multi-dimensional view of the battlefields. But what sets Ukraine apart is not the access, it's the execution. Western intelligence has never been used with this level of creativity and agility. Ukraine's analysts don't just receive information, they reinterpret it, cross-match it with local data, and act on it faster than any bureaucracy could allow. That agility has become Ukraine's signature strength, a kind of digital guerrilla warfare that turns intelligence into an art form. And make no mistake, this intelligence war is as psychological as it is physical. Russia's commanders are now forced to question every movement, every transmission, every vehicle they deploy. They can no longer assume safety, even hundreds of miles from the front. Ukrainian cyber units have infiltrated radio frequencies, jammed drone feeds, and even planted false data to mislead enemy troops. The result is chaos within the Russian ranks, a confusion that weakens morale and erodes trust in command structures. In the age of smart warfare, confusion is the most lethal weapon of all. This operation also revealed something deeper. Ukraine has mastered the balance between human intuition and machine precision. Data alone doesn't win wars, people do. And Ukraine's intelligence corps, young analysts, often in their 20s, trained in cybersecurity and AI modeling, represent a new generation of defenders. They're the silent architects behind the strikes, the unseen tacticians transforming warfare into something both technical and deeply human. These are not soldiers in trenches. They are coders, mathematicians, and data scientists fighting a war from screens and servers. And yet, their work saves as many lives as any soldier on the front line. What makes this even more compelling is how Ukraine's intelligence infrastructure has grown despite constant Russian cyber attacks. Moscow has tried repeatedly to cripple Kyiv's digital backbone targeting, power grids, data centers, and communication satellites. Yet every time, Ukraine rebuilds faster and smarter. Each attack becomes an upgrade, each breach a lesson. It's as though every attempt to weaken Ukraine has only strengthened its resolve to innovate. What Russia intended as disruption has become Ukraine's catalyst for adaptation. When Ukraine finally launched its Counterstrike, the results spoke louder than any press statement could. The targets hit were not random. They were nerve centers, fuel hubs, radar arrays, command posts that made Russia's civilian attacks possible. Every explosion was a data point, closing a loop, every strike a signature of intelligence-driven warfare at its finest. It wasn't vengeance, it was precision. It was strategy disguised as speed. In that moment, Ukraine proved something the world is still trying to grasp, that in the 21st century, wars are not won by size or intimidation, they're won by information. When Russia fired missiles at civilians, it was acting out of desperation. When Ukraine struck back, it was acting out of knowledge. And knowledge, in this war, has become the most powerful weapon of all. When Ukraine's counterstrike hit its targets, Moscow was caught off guard in a way that it hadn't been since the early days of the invasion. The Kremlin, long accustomed to dictating the tempo of this war, suddenly found itself scrambling for control. Command lines that once flowed in rigid order dissolved into a tangle of confusion. Reports began filtering through encrypted Russian telegram channels of fuel shortages, communication breakdowns, and frantic relocations of command posts. It was as if, for one shocking moment, the very system that prides itself on control had lost its grip. Ukraine's retaliation didn't just damage infrastructure, it cracked the illusion of Russian invincibility. Inside the walls of the Russian Defense Ministry, the atmosphere was tense. Intelligence sources described the sudden disappearance of senior field commanders from internal communications and the urgent summoning of generals to Moscow for emergency consultations. The speed of Ukraine's response shattered the Kremlin's assumption that Kyiv would need days to organize. Instead, Ukraine struck back before Russia had even begun its victory narrative on state television. That was the first blow, not on the battlefield, but in the propaganda war. By the time Russian anchors tried to shape a story of minor setbacks, videos of Ukrainian drone strikes on key Russian facilities were already circulating. Globally, the Kremlin's tight grip on perception had slipped, and it couldn't get it back. For decades, Russia has relied on the image of military supremacy, an empire of power and discipline capable of overwhelming any opponent. But when Ukraine's missiles found their marks inside Russian-controlled zones, that myth began to unravel. The soldiers on the ground saw it first. Panic spread through supply convoys as fuel depots burned. Drone operators reported losing visual feeds and GPS signals, leaving them blind. Communications officers received conflicting orders, some told to hold positions, others told to retreat and regroup. What began as a controlled chain of command dissolved into chaos. The psychological toll of realizing that their once impenetrable defense lines were now transparent to the enemy was devastating. Even among Russia's inner circle, cracks appeared. Anonymous sources within Moscow's security apparatus admitted to journalists that they were shocked by the precision and timing of Ukraine's retaliation. One described it as a ghost moving faster than thought. The admission itself was remarkable. The Russian state, which thrives on denial, could no longer fully hide the fact that its military had been blindsided. The sophistication of Ukraine's strikes exposed an uncomfortable truth that Russia's much vaunted defense systems, the pride of its propaganda machine, could be penetrated with surgical precision. It was a humiliation not only for its generals, but for the narrative of dominance that Putin himself had built his regime upon. As the night dragged on, confusion deepened. Field reports became fragmented, orders contradicted one another, and frontline troops found themselves cut off from higher command. In several regions, Russian soldiers reportedly resorted to using civilian communication apps after their secure channels failed. The image of a high-tech superpower had crumbled into the reality of an army improvising with smartphones. Meanwhile, Ukrainian intelligence units intercepted these transmissions, mapping out Russian disarray in real time. What had begun as a counterstrike was rapidly becoming a demonstration of control, Ukraine dictating the pace, Russia reacting in panic. What made this moment so consequential wasn't just the damage inflicted, but the symbolism. For the first time, Russia appeared vulnerable, not because of sanctions or diplomacy, but because it was outmaneuvered on its own battlefield. Putin's silence in the hours following the strikes was deafening. State media avoided the topic altogether, choosing instead to air footage of old military exercises. But silence, too, can speak volumes. In that silence, observers saw something rare uncertainty from a regime that thrives on aggression. Analysts across Europe began calling it a psychological collapse, a shift in the balance of confidence that could alter the trajectory of the entire war. Even among ordinary Russians, the unease was palpable. Social media flooded with speculation, with citizens questioning why internal facilities were suddenly on fire and why official channels had gone dark. That kind of doubt is dangerous in an authoritarian state built on perception. The Kremlin could censor, but it couldn't contain the truth fast enough. Every burning depot, every intercepted transmission, every delayed announcement became evidence that Russia had been surprised, outmaneuvered, and most importantly, outsmarted. Ukraine's strike didn't just hit targets, it hit the psychological core of the Russian war machine. It revealed that beneath the layers of propaganda and pride lies a military apparatus stretched thin, fighting on outdated assumptions and fractured communication. In that moment of confusion, the world saw what Moscow had tried to hide, a power structure built on fear, not strength. The shock was not just tactical, it was existential. The empire that once dictated fear was, for the first time, feeling it. And that realization may prove more destructive to the Kremlin than any missile ever could. The global reaction to Ukraine's lightning-fast retaliation was immediate and electric. Within hours of the counterstrike, foreign ministries across Europe and North America were lit up with secure calls, briefings, and intelligence updates. Diplomats who had grown used to cautious optimism suddenly found themselves speaking in sharper, more decisive tones. What Ukraine accomplished wasn't just a military response, it was a geopolitical statement that rippled across capitals and corridors of power. The message was unmistakable. This war had entered a new phase, and Ukraine was now setting the pace. In Washington, senior officials described the operation as strategically flawless, a response that demonstrated not only courage, but competence at a level that many analysts had doubted Ukraine could achieve under. Constant bombardment. The Pentagon's early assessments praised the precision of Ukraine's strikes and the speed of coordination between intelligence, cyber units, and field operatives. For the Biden administration, which has walked a delicate line between support and escalation, this operation reinforced the narrative that Ukraine could be trusted with advanced weaponry and real-time intelligence. Behind closed doors, it reignited conversations about expanding Ukraine's air defense capabilities and supplying longer-range systems. The tone shifted from sympathy to respect, and that shift matters in diplomacy. In Europe, the reaction was equally powerful. Leaders who had once feared provoking Moscow began to see that restraint might no longer serve stability. In Berlin, Chancellor Olaf Scholz, under increasing domestic pressure for his cautious stance, faced a flood of new voices demanding that Germany move faster on arms deliveries. In Paris, President Emmanuel Macron, who had long advocated for dialogue with Putin, described Ukraine's retaliation as measured and justified, signaling a hardening of tone from one of Europe's most diplomatic leaders. Even in neutral capitals like Vienna and Bern, statements began to echo the same sentiment. Ukraine's right to self-defense is not just legal, it is essential to preserving the moral fabric of the international order. But perhaps the most telling response came from the Kremlin's own allies, or rather, those who once pretended to be. China's state media, usually careful to parrot Moscow's narratives, gave the Ukrainian operation surprisingly factual coverage. Turkey, which has maintained a fragile balancing act between both sides, quietly increased drone component shipments to Kyiv. Even India, a key trade partner for Russia, refrained from its usual neutral rhetoric. The silence from Moscow's friends spoke volumes. It reflected uncertainty, hesitation, and a recognition that Ukraine's intelligence-led warfare was eroding Russia's aura of inevitability. The global chessboard was shifting, and for once, it wasn't the Kremlin moving the pieces. Public opinion in the West also surged in Ukraine's favor. Footage of precision drone strikes and intercepted Russian communications went viral across social media, reframing Ukraine from victim to victor in the global consciousness. The narrative that had once focused on suffering now pivoted to strategy, innovation, and brilliance. This shift in tone wasn't just emotional, it was political. In democratic nations, where public opinion often drives policy, renewed enthusiasm for Ukraine's resilience put pressure on lawmakers to increase aid. The story of Ukraine's instant and brilliant revenge became more than a headline. It became a rallying cry. At the United Nations, Ukraine's diplomats seized the moment with precision equal to their military. In a fiery address to the General Assembly, Ukraine's ambassador declared that justice is not vengeance, it is defense against evil. The speech resonated in a chamber that has too often been divided along predictable lines. Nations that once abstained from condemning Russia's aggression began quietly shifting their votes. In the world of diplomacy, such subtle changes can alter the tide of history. The Ukrainian counterstrike didn't just hit targets, it recalibrated alliances. Meanwhile, Russia found itself increasingly cornered. Sanctions that had begun to lose their sting gained renewed moral justification. Countries that had hesitated to enforce energy embargoes now found new reasons to act. Even major corporations, many of which had slowly begun exploring re-entry into the Russian market, froze their plans. Moscow's aggression had once inspired fear, now it inspired fatigue. Ukraine's calculated success exposed Russia's aggression as not only cruel, but clumsy. And in a world driven by image, that shift was devastating. The diplomatic shift also carried a deeper symbolic weight. For the first time since the invasion began, Ukraine wasn't being spoken about as a nation to be saved, it was being spoken about as a nation to be followed. Military academies across NATO began studying the operation as a model for 21st century hybrid warfare. Analysts called it a demonstration of brain over brawn, the exact reversal of what Russia's doctrine represents. Ukraine had managed to transform its battlefield victories into diplomatic capital, something even powerful nations struggle to achieve. This global ripple effect had another consequence. Moscow's isolation deepened in ways no missile could inflict. Every new statement of solidarity, every renewed shipment of aid, every political endorsement became another brick in the wall surrounding the Kremlin. Russia, once the center of gravity in Eastern Europe, now found itself orbiting the very forces it tried to dominate. Ukraine's strike had done what years of negotiations couldn't. It united a fractured world around one simple truth, that intelligence, courage, and moral clarity still have power against tyranny. And in that unity, a subtle but undeniable shift took place. Ukraine was no longer merely defending its borders. It was defending the principles of sovereignty, resilience, and justice that much of the democratic world had taken for granted. That's what made the global reaction so profound. It wasn't just applause for a successful military operation. It was recognition of something larger, that in standing up to Moscow with brilliance instead of fear, Ukraine had reminded the world what real strength looks like. When Ukraine launched its counterstrike in the wake of Russia's brutal civilian attacks, it was about far more than retaliation. It was a declaration, a clear, deliberate statement to the world that Ukraine will not bend, will not break, and will not allow terror to define its future. The brilliance of the operation lay not only in its precision or speed, but in its symbolism. Every missile launched, every drone deployed carried a message written in resolve. You can destroy our buildings, but you will never destroy our spirit. In that moment, Ukraine transformed pain into power, turning tragedy into the fuel for defiance that resonated far beyond the battlefield. What made this response extraordinary was the restraint that guided it. Ukraine could have answered cruelty with chaos, could have struck back in kind at civilian areas across the border, but it didn't. Instead, it chose discipline. The counterstrike was surgical, aimed at dismantling Russia's capacity to wage war, not mirroring its brutality. That choice spoke volumes. It showed a nation that understands the difference between vengeance and justice, a nation unwilling to lose its humanity even as it fights for its survival. And that moral clarity, more than any weapon, became Ukraine's most powerful asset. Across Europe and beyond, observers saw a pattern that had been building since the beginning of the invasion. Every time Russia struck civilians, hoping to break Ukraine's will, Ukraine only grew more determined, more innovative, and more united. This latest attack and Ukraine's instant response reinforced that pattern in dramatic fashion. It wasn't simply a counterattack, it was a reaffirmation of identity. To Ukraine, resistance is not just a military objective, it's cultural, emotional, and deeply personal. This is a country that has learned to turn despair into strategy, that has discovered how to weaponize resilience. In cities scarred by war, the echoes of this response reverberated like a heartbeat. Across Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa, people gathered in candlelight vigils not to mourn what was lost, but to celebrate what endured. There was no sense of victimhood in their eyes, only determination. Street artists painted murals of strength and hope. Soldiers sent messages home promising victory, and families rebuilt what was destroyed with the same quiet defiance that has come to define this nation. Every act of normalcy became an act of resistance. Every light switched on in a bombed-out neighborhood, a signal to the world that Ukraine refuses to live in darkness. This defiance carries weight far beyond national pride. It has redefined the psychology of modern conflict. Where Russia fights to dominate through fear, Ukraine fights to inspire through endurance. It is a subtle but seismic shift. Russia's power depends on compliance. Ukraine's power thrives on courage. Each Ukrainian success on the battlefield erodes not just Russian strategy, but the very foundation of authoritarian control. The Kremlin's mistake has been in misunderstanding the nature of resolve. You cannot bomb out belief. You cannot silence a nation that finds meaning in survival. This new kind of warfare driven by willpower, as much as technology has changed how the world perceives Ukraine. It is no longer seen as the underdog in a lopsided struggle, but as a nation leading a masterclass in courage and intelligence. Analysts have begun calling this the morality of modern warfare, a blend of strategic innovation and ethical clarity that challenges the traditional notions of victory. Ukraine's refusal to mirror Russia's cruelty, even under unimaginable pressure, exposes the weakness of brute force. It reminds the world that strength without humanity is nothing but destruction wearing a uniform. Inside the Kremlin, this realization is becoming impossible to ignore. Russian officials may continue to speak in the language of dominance, but behind those walls, they understand what Ukraine's actions mean. The empire they are fighting to restore is crumbling, not under military defeat, but under moral collapse. Every time Ukraine acts with restraint and precision, it deepens that fracture. Every demonstration of Ukrainian discipline contrasts sharply with Moscow's chaos and cruelty. This is how power shifts, not with explosions, but with example. Ukraine's stance has also inspired others. From Warsaw to Washington, from Helsinki to Tokyo, nations have begun to see in Ukraine a reflection of their own democratic struggle, the eternal tension between tyranny and freedom. The country's ability to maintain its principles under fire has reignited belief in something many feared was lost, that democracy, when tested, can still fight back with both courage and conscience. It is a reminder that resilience is contagious, that even in an age of cynicism, integrity can still lead the charge. When Russia hit civilians, it expected to see surrender. What it saw instead was something it couldn't calculate: hope sharpened into resolve, unity turned into strategy, grief transformed into brilliance. Ukraine didn't just survive the assault, it elevated itself above it. And in doing so, it sent a message that will outlast this war. That freedom, when challenged by tyranny, doesn't retreat, it rises. And every time Russia strikes, that rise becomes faster, fiercer, and more unbreakable. Because this isn't just a fight for territory, it's a fight for the human spirit. And in that arena, Ukraine has already won something that no empire can ever take away. So as the smoke clears tonight over both Kharkiv and Belgorod, one truth stands above the noise. Ukraine is not the victim in this story anymore, it's the strategist. It's the force rewriting what modern resistance looks like. And it's doing so with heart, with intelligence, and with an unshakable belief that freedom, when threatened, can be fierce, fast, and fearless. That's the story tonight. Russia hit civilians, and Ukraine's revenge was instant and brilliant. Good night. Stay informed, stay strong, because history is being written minute by minute.